This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to welcome Keith Mallinson to the show. Now, Mr. Mallinson is the founder and president of WiseHarbor, which specializes in solving commercial problems in wireless and mobile communications. Additionally, he's an author and sought-after expert witness with over 20 years of experience. Mr. Mallinson holds an MBA from London Business School. Mr. Mallinson, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Good to speak to you.
Excellent. Let's jump into it. You have a background in electrical engineering, industry analysis, and mobile communications, but how did you first get into expert witnessing?
So I was working as an industry analyst for a major industry research firm based in Boston, Massachusetts. And we just got approached, my firm got approached looking for an expert witness who knew the cellular industry. And I stepped up to that.
Excellent. Did you have somebody mentor you or show you the ropes or anything like that?
Not really. Certainly not within my firm. My firm from time to time had done some expert witness work, I think, historically, but I got no mentoring internally. However, I got a lot of mentoring and assistance and support from counsel that I was working with. And I would say that that has been the case throughout my career working as an expert witness. The attorneys I've worked with have been excellent in terms of coaching me and coaxing me and developing me. So that's been really helpful.
Let's dig into that a little bit. What are some of the kinds of things that they tell you that's helpful for an expert witness, especially when you're still a newer expert witness? What was some of the good advice that you have?
Well, it can vary depending on the case, but a typical thing, for example, when one is preparing for a deposition, I can remember this early on, having submitted an expert report, maybe a rebuttal, and I'm being deposed, and I've got all these things that I want to say. I'm bursting with all these ideas and things that I want to get over. And the attorney kind of brings me back and says, look, we don't win the case in the deposition. So the attorney was really seeing it more as a kind of damage limitation exercise and coaching me to try to stick to the questions it had, answer them. Obviously, you have the opportunity to develop your answers to make sure that they can't leave a misleading impression on the record, but you're not there to help the opposing counsel. That's not the purpose of the deposition, for example. So that has been quite a useful guideline. However, I will say with one attorney, I can recall many years later, I was actually encouraged to do the reverse. Because of the nature of the case, they were never expecting to go to trial, and he was encouraging me to be verbose and talk on a lot and get more onto the record because he felt it would actually be useful in what he had to do on the legal front, knowing that we were never actually, or he thought it extremely unlikely that I would ever be testifying in trial.
Oh, that's really interesting. And is that advice that you've used in other cases, or was that kind of a really niche incident?
I think it's a kind of one-off, but now when I am preparing for deposition, in fact, I was preparing recently for one, I recounted that tale and said, which category are you in? And this recent example, they were clearly in category one, that they wanted me to take the more orthodox approach to sticking strictly to what was being asked about and keeping my responses fairly narrow, but still encouraging me to expand when necessary to ensure that the right impression was, or a full account and a full explanation was given.
Sure. What are some of the first things that you talk about? You get the call from an attorney and you're considering an engagement. How is that process? What are the things that you consider? What are the things that they consider? How do you decide whether or not to accept an engagement? And how do they decide whether or not to accept you as an expert?
So when I'm approached, sometimes the people approaching me, maybe it's some agency, and they're completely off target. Because it's the technology industry, they assume that if they need a technical expert, and they're really just, maybe it's a bit of a shotgun approach. They're just hoping I happen to have the specific technical expertise they require. And maybe it's because they haven't done their homework. I don't know, maybe the lack of understanding, and it's not a mismatch. So I get some of those. But what I do find, and particularly the ones that just seemingly pop up completely out of the blue, I think it's where they have, the attorneys particularly have done their due diligence or their research work carefully, and they actually know from looking at my resume and looking at the many publications I've written, they know exactly where my competencies lie. And I find that many times there's a very good fit right from the get-go. But still, when I'm speaking to them for the first time, I make sure that I've done my homework. And it's normally what I need to do is just remind myself of the part of the industry that they're interested in, because my expertise spans quite broadly across the whole of the cellular telecommunications industry. And I go deep in certain areas, but I'm quite broad. And sometimes I need to refresh my mind about certain areas if that's their particular interest, because I want to make sure that I have relevant examples to talk about in industry, companies in the industry, things that are current developments and or such like.
You are in such a broad industry, and your knowledge is so broad. How do you know what to focus on? How do you remain an expert in all of these different areas, especially in a dynamic field, such as yours, where not only is the technology changing, but the legal framework itself is changing? What do you do to stay abreast of everything, and how important is it that you do so?
Well, again, I'm not a deep technical expert, so in each area there may be a lot of very specific things to know, but I'm a commercial expert, and I understand how the whole ecosystem works and how different parts of it play with each other. So for example, in a dispute so I've done several cases in the tower industry. So this is the cellular towers where mobile phone operators co-locate their equipment. So in contractual disputes then it's important for me to have a good background understanding of the industry for tower co-location, but also for the mobile operating companies that co-locate on those towers. So you've got two different segments within the same industry and how they play with each other. So it's important actually to have an understanding that spans across those two. That's certainly how my expertise has been applied. So it's difficult. I keep myself broad, but I go deep in certain areas, and they do span right across the cellular industry. And but I tended to limit myself to cellular telecommunications, but within it I have my industry expertise, and also I do quite a bit of economic and financial analysis, so including damages assessments and valuations and such like.
Sure. I'd like to back up for a minute when we were talking about, those first calls. Once you've decided to take on a client, do you add any specific terms in contracts? Is there anything that you like to do to protect yourself, or that just works better for you to make sure you get paid on time? Anything like that?
Well, I find that generally speaking, from the if you like, the top flight law firms, their engagement letters I generally find are pretty good, because they've been here before, and I'm generally pretty happy with them. But there are things that I will do. Sometimes Some assignments, I will insist on having a non-refundable retainer fee. So in other words, if I've got, for example, I'm concerned that I'll be engaged, but I'll never actually be given any work to do, just to be kind of put on hold. I don't want to be a kind of free option just to be taken out of the frame so I can't testify for the other side, for example.
Right.
You know,
Well, your time is valuable, right?
I wouldn't want to be in that position. So sometimes I have that. Other things, in terms of my liability, I seek to limit that to be no more than my fees. Okay, aside, fraud or gross negligence, you can have that caveat there, and
Sure.
I do, and I actually volunteer that. If I haven't done that, then my maximum exposure is going to be the limit of the fees that I've invoiced. And that's tended to work. Now, actually, there's one other thing that I would now put in. I've learned of late. I had not been paid by a client by anything other than electronic transfer for, I think, more than a decade. But I have come across a client that has preferred to pay by check, and I'm not really geared up for that. And it can add another 30 days before you can actually get your hands on the cash. So I think in future I'm going to insist on electronic payments as a matter of contract.
It seems a little archaic at this point, doesn't it? Let's talk about being an expert witness a little bit more generally. What do you find meaningful?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I believe that litigation is essential. Some people are very critical of the United States as a very litigious society, and lawyers make a lot of money, and
Sure.
and such like. There's a lot of criticism of that, but I think it is an important check that is required on commerce. That if there weren't the antitrust laws, if there weren't patent infringement restrictions, then I think there would be abuse. So I think it is important that there's litigation. So I feel that what I do, regardless of which side I'm working for, I believe it's actually an essential activity. It's worthy, and so that makes me feel that my work is worthwhile.
You said regardless of which side you're working on or working for, obviously you're talking about defendant or plaintiff. That's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that, there's expert witnesses, and sometimes you get plaintiff cases and sometimes you get defendant cases. Do you have a different approach that you take between the two, or is it largely the same?
I don't know whether I'd say there's a different approach. I've worked on both sides because, I publish a lot of material. I've
Sure.
many reports. Go to my website, there are floods and floods of them. And so my opinions, my position on certain things are fairly kind of clear. And so, for example, I've done a lot of work in the area of standard essential patent licensing. And the kind of things that I've written have tended to be in support of the patent owners. And so I naturally align with, I guess you would regard that generally as being the plaintiff's side. Of course, the way the litigation occurs, sometimes things are back to front, but generally speaking, and by that I mean, it's a declaratory judgment or something that's sought by an infringer. But generally speaking, I'm on that side. So there is a bit of kind of self-selection. So it is unlikely that an infringing a company that's infringing standard essential patents is going to come to me to help them establish reasonable royalties for standard essential patents. It's much more likely to be the other side.
Sure. You've been doing this for quite a long time. As I said at the start, you've done this for over 20 years now. How has the role changed? Has the work changed? Have expectations, logistics? How has the job in general changed over the years?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure that I can perceive an overall industry-wide change. I mean, things have ebbed and flowed for me. I've done a whole variety of different cases. As I mentioned, I've done several in the tower industry. So I did several in the 2000s. And then there's a bit of a lull, but I've come back and I've started doing expert witness work in that area again after not having done that. And meanwhile, I've done a whole variety of other kinds of cases, all within the cellular industry. And in some of them, as I've mentioned, have been to do with patent licensing. But it's really, I don't think there's any distinct sort of underlying overarching trend I can point to.
Well, one trend that I've heard from a number of interviewees is that they've noticed a lot of cases, at least among people who have been doing this for a long time, they've noticed cases more often go to settlement than they used to. Is that something that you've noticed?
Well, I would certainly say my experience is consistent with that. I must admit, if I think of, I mean, I've been to trial, I think 5 times, and
wow.
not for a while. I always think that I'm going to go to trial, and yes, the 11th hour there's a settlement that happens again and again. So I'm not a very sort of statistically representative sample, but certainly my experience is consistent with that. I've certainly been involved in more cases that have settled in the last few years than if I go back 15 years.
Is there a difference in your role as an expert or your preparations or anything else when you're fairly certain that the case is probably going to go to settlement?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of examples where it is very unlikely that the case would go to trial. But others, it's a kind of big maybe one way or the other. And I don't think it makes a lot of difference. I think what I would say in terms of preparation, getting more into the practical side of things, no matter how much you think you're going to go to trial, just brace yourself for the fact or the likelihood that it won't actually happen. So, for example, when you're managing your calendar, recognize that you've got weeks blocked out, and then all of a sudden you may find that you've got no fee earning work to do in that period of time when you thought you're going to be at trial. Book fully refundable hotels and airfares, because you might find yourself having some difficulties expensing something that you've not actually seemingly not incurred because you've not taken the flights and you've not slept in the hotels. So there's that. So just beware of the fact that there is always a significant chance that they're going to settle, no matter what the attorneys say.
Exactly. Do you always have to prepare as though it's going to go to trial? In other words, you have to do mock cross-examinations or, engage in typical preparation as though you will go to trial?
You certainly should. And I would say with the firms that I've worked with on the cases, I mean, these are real pros, they're top flight. And absolutely, your ability to be able to get a good settlement means that you have to be, I mean, I don't get involved in settlement negotiations, but it's clear your ability to get a good settlement means you got to be able to walk away or walk into trial, sort of walk away from the negotiating table and walk into trial, at any time right up to the last moment. So you've got to be fully prepared. You negotiate from a position of strength. If you try to just economize and wing it, and I think that's a kind of dangerous position to be in.
Have you found yourself working on teams with other experts? For example, you would be the technical expert, then there might be a damages expert. Do you work with other expert types?
Yes, in all sorts of ways. I find on some of the cases, some of the let's say the not so very large ones, that I'm a kind of one-stop shop. And
Sure.
So I've got this capability of being an industry expert in my field, but also having the financial and economic capabilities to be able to do valuations and damages assessments. So my very first case actually was an example of exactly that, because I was valuing a cellular reseller, what would now be called a mobile virtual network operator. And so I was applying both my industry skills and also my financial and economic analysis to that. But in other cases, yes, the counsel and the client will decide that they want to have a separate damages financial expert. I've worked on some very large cases where there have been some eminent economists working, and I've been working in collaboration with big teams of economists and such like. It works in all kinds of different ways, and you know, when I mean, for example, in one case where I certainly could have done all the financial analysis. The client counsel liked the idea, liked to have a separation between a damages or evaluation expert and what I was doing. They felt tactically that could be better in terms of the way the dynamics of depositions and cross-examination and such like. And in other cases, if I'm working with a technical expert, I may, or with an economist or whatever, then they will come up with some figures and I will just rely on them, and so I may be asked, well, there's this figure here, you don't know whether that's a good number or not. How do you know that that's valid? And I'll just say, the way I've worked on this is I'm entirely relying on that. That's just an input to what I'm doing. So
Sure.
any kind of tire kicking or questioning of that assumption into my model needs to be, it has to be a challenge to that other expert. But when it comes down to actually working, I will work maybe in quite close collaboration sometimes with those experts. Sometimes not. Maybe sometimes I not even speak to them. It all varies. It depends from case to case, and depends on the kind of working style of counsel, how they want to run the case.
So all the experts don't always coordinate. It depends on on kind of a case by case basis, depending on the facts of the case.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by coordinate. I mean, I'd say that there's coordination when you say, well, you have a demarcation. What Keith does starts here and stops here, and what Fred does, is on that kind of dividing line. So there is that kind of coordination or delineation at any rate. Now, in some cases, I'm working with experts where we'll have conference calls and we'll be discussing things. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't happen. It all depends.
Do you have a different experience depending on the type of case that you're on? In other words, if it's a class action or a tort, is it different than whether it's antitrust or commercial litigation? Does the field itself impact kind of your experience as an expert witness?
Well, what's required is very different. I mean, I've worked on a lot of antitrust cases, but generally as a non-testifying expert. And it's been very much a team kind of effort where I've been working very closely with the attorneys. I would say, yeah, that's where the teamwork comes in a lot. So I've got a deep history in the cellular industry. I find with the attorneys, I mean, a large part of what I do, it's not nominally in my job description, but what I actually do, certainly early on, is educate them, help them explain how this convoluted, complex industry I work in, what the dynamics are. And, they're smart people and they learn pretty quickly. But I'm giving them a kind of technical tutorials and commercial tutorials. So that is an important part of what I do. In terms of the different cases, well, there are different. So, for example, I made the point about settlement versus going to trial. Class actions very rarely go to trial. So it's likely to be a settlement, and that's sort of understood through the whole process. Although actually, probably early on, I didn't get it because work on a class action maybe many years ago. I'm told when the trial date is, and I put it in my calendar, thinking that that's really going to happen. And it's only when you start to, have the informal chats with counsel, and you say, well, what's the probability that this is going to settle, or what's the probability you're going to win in trial and whatever, and then you kind of tease it out of them as to how these cases work. And certainly one thing I've kind of learned over the years is it's useful to talk to ask counsel lots of questions, and to really get a good understanding of what they're concerned about, what their objectives are, strategies and tactics are through the whole case, because that's not always obvious, and cases vary enormously.
Does that aid in making a positive attorney-expert relationship, that kind of communication?
Oh yeah, I think having a good relationship with the attorneys is vital, and I'm pleased. I feel that I have really good relationships with my attorneys. I've enjoyed working with them, and I work with the partners, and I've spent a lot of time working at the associate level, and that's been great as well, because those people often are more accessible. They've got more time, and
Sure.
you can dig deep with them than partners. But it varies. I mean, it's work. It's always good to work at multiple levels, have good working relationships. And including to the paralegals as well, because they can be very helpful in, you feel, you need to get hold of some more documents, and to help you, figure out where they are and get them delivered and such like that can be useful. I mean, by delivered, I mean, obviously made available online. I don't do much on paper anymore. That's a big change. If you want to change from what I was doing 20 years ago, a lot of paper. I have very little to do with paper anymore.
Do you find that more convenient or less convenient? I've heard both.
I find it more convenient. I mean, but now it's my working practice has changed. And 20 years ago, I had a little laptop and lots of paper, and now I have no paper, and I've got two high definition monitors on my desk. and so I'll have different windows open, and so I get a PDF, for example, I got a deposition transcript or an opposing expert's report or something like that, and then I'll mark it up in yellow, but I'll do it on the PDF, the electronic version. I find that that's useful because as you have an electronic version, and you can use the search function.
Sure.
Is extremely valuable. You can find the keywords very, very rapidly, which you clearly can't do on paper. And you also have the yellow highlighting for when you're just racing your way through the document, looking for the kind of key things that got you excited when you looked at it the first time. I find that is a much better way of working than the old-fashioned way of paper. And maybe I'm lazy. I just don't like having books or strewn all around the office and having to swing around from one to another.
Oh, that's not lazy. That's just efficient. Before we wrap up, do you have any advice for newer expert witnesses who are just kind of getting started?
Well, just little practical tips I discovered. So when I'm doing my kind of finding my way on a case, doing my research, I do a lot of, obviously I'm looking at the case record, but also I'm looking at public sources. So I'm using dear old Google, use Wikipedia occasionally. People are very critical of Wikipedia. It's actually, of course, you don't want to cite Wikipedia per se, but you go to Wikipedia and the way Wikipedia is structured is everything has to be supported and cited. So go to the citations and lift those, use those, and make sure you keep track of everything, because there's nothing more frustrating when down the line you're writing something and you thought, oh, I had a brilliant source for that I'm making this point and I need to provide support, because everything you put in your export report you need to have support for. You need citations. And it's so frustrating when you cannot figure out where on earth that source was. So grab everything. And so what I tend to do is I put a Word document up and I just put loads and loads of hyperlinks in there and little snippets of things that might possibly be useful. And then if they make it to the report, make sure that when the report is filed, that you actually capture those things, print them to PDF. There's nothing more frustrating than you go to cases can last years. You go back a year or two later and the hyperlink's dead and you can't find the source anymore, and then you've got a problem trying to find it. So things like that. And same kind of thing with numbers as well. So I do damages and valuations and such. Like, I don't do any calculations on paper, or I try to avoid it. I do everything every time, and even the most trivial little calculations, do them on a spreadsheet and make sure all your input numbers, all your variables, you've got some source. Where did that number come from and why? Because it's so frustrating later when you go to your report and you see you've got a number that you put in there and you think, well, how on earth did I derive that figure? It's not that it's wrong, but it's a time waste when you've got to then kind of recreate it. When you did it right the first time, just make sure you've recorded everything and put privileged and confidential draft work product on everything to make sure that, and hopefully what you're doing in these drafts is not discoverable, but I'll leave that down to the attorneys to make sure that that isn't the case. Because you want a bit of free hand to be able to get things wrong and try, brainstorm different kind of concepts in terms of what you're doing with your assessments. You don't want to be held down. Well, why on earth did you think that? Why did you consider doing it that way, Mr. Mallinson? Well, I didn't really consider it. It was just like, let's just trying out a few kind of different approaches to doing evaluation or such like.
Absolutely sage advice, Mr. Mallinson. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to our listeners for joining me for another discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.